When I saw my husband holding my diary, my heart skipped, not from fear of some trivial secret being exposed, but because of the words I knew were written there. Words I had meant only for myself. Words that should never have been read aloud, never even seen. He stood in the middle of our kitchen, his thumb frozen on the page as if afraid to turn it, and I felt my life collapsing in slow motion. I took a step forward, instinctively reaching for the notebook, but he jerked it back with a swiftness that startled me. He kept reading. His eyes moved line by line, his expression changing in ways I couldn't track fast enough, confusion, then surprise, then something darker. I could feel the blood drain from my face as he turned another page, then another. He wasn't skimming, he was devouring it, word by word. I had forgotten about those entries, the ones I wrote late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, when my thoughts felt too heavy to keep locked in my head. Entries about things I hadn't said out loud to anyone, about feelings I thought I could just bleed onto paper and leave there. His breathing changed first, shallow, then sharp, then heavy. I heard it from across the room. I wanted to scream, to tell him it wasn't what it looked like, but the words caught in my throat. He turned to another page, and his fingers trembled. That was when I knew he'd reached the part one dreaded most, the part that explained everything, and yet nothing. The part that would set fire to the life we'd built, or maybe just burn holes through it big enough for the truth to leak out. Then something happened. A slip of paper, tucked between the pages, slid out and fluttered to the floor. He bent down, picked it up, and unfolded it slowly, like it might explode in his hands. It wasn't a page from the diary. It was a note. His eyes darted across it, and his face went pale. He didn't speak. He didn't even blink. I bit down hard on the inside of my cheek, an old habit when panic took over. My nerves felt raw, like exposed wires. The air between us was thick, suffocating. He looked at me once, his gaze sharp, unreadable, then turned back to the note. My pulse hammered in my ears. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake that changed absolutely everything, and now, as I stood in that kitchen, I knew there was no way back. I didn't know what to say, or if there was anything left to say. But let me tell you how it really happened. Before I share with you the truth I've been burying, the truth I never meant for anyone to see, think about this. Have you ever kept a secret so tightly, so desperately, only for it to spill open in the worst possible way? It didn't start the way you might think. There wasn't some dramatic lightning bolt of temptation or a sudden collapse of the life I knew. It was quieter than that, more ordinary. That's what makes it harder to explain, because it began in the quiet moments of my marriage, the spaces between us that had been growing wider for years without either of us really noticing. My husband and I weren't unhappy. At least, I didn't think we were. There were no screaming fights, no slammed doors, no cold silences that lasted for weeks. We shared meals, we paid bills, we even laughed sometimes. But somewhere along the way, our life had become a pattern so predictable it felt like tracing the same line on paper until you wear a hole through it. Dinner. News on his tablet. A few polite questions about my day, answered with equally polite responses. Nights spent in the same bed but on different islands. I had convinced myself that this was what long marriages became. That contentment was supposed to look like routine. But lately, I found myself sitting across from him at dinner, watching him scroll through headlines with the faint glow of the screen on his face, and feeling something like absence. Not anger. Not resentment. Just absence. The university was my refuge. It had been for years, but lately it felt like the only place I remembered who I was before my life became so muted. I loved teaching literature, the way certain books could spark debates, make students lean forward in their seats, challenge me with questions I hadn't thought about in years. It reminded me I still had a voice. That's where I noticed him. He wasn't the kind of student you forget in a crowd, not because he was loud or disruptive, but because he listened differently. While most of the class stared at their phones or scribbled down what they thought would be on the exam, he watched me. Not in the unsettling way some students do, but with the kind of focus that made you want to speak better, think sharper. He stayed after lectures to ask questions, not the obvious ones, but the kind that tugged at the edges of the discussion. He'd bring up passages from books we weren't even studying, connect them to something we'd talked about weeks before. It was flattering, sure, but it was more than that. It was invigorating. Like being reminded that someone still saw me as more than a fixture, more than a part of the furniture in my own life. At first, I dismissed it as a harmless spark, something to brighten the grayness of my days, nothing more. I was his professor, he was a student. There were boundaries, rules, the unspoken lines we all understood. But then I caught myself lingering on his questions, thinking about his comments long after class ended. I'd find myself waiting for his raised hand, wondering what he'd say. I'd catch his eyes following me as I erased the board, and I'd feel a flicker of something I couldn't name, something I hadn't felt in years. One evening, after another dinner eaten mostly in silence, I found myself digging through an old drawer and pulling out a notebook I hadn't touched in a decade, my diary. It was dusty, the leather cover worn soft with age. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened it, feeling oddly exposed even though no one was around. I wrote that night. At first, it was about the small things, the way the kitchen light hummed, the stack of unread mail, the dinner that tasted like cardboard because I barely noticed what I was eating. But soon, the words turned into something else. I wrote about the lecture earlier that day, about the conversation with him that had lingered in my mind. I wrote about how it felt to be seen. I didn't mean anything by it. At least, that's what I told myself. They were just thoughts, harmless scribbles on paper. But as I wrote, I felt a release, a clarity I hadn't realized I needed. The next morning, I put the diary back in the drawer and went about my day like always. Breakfast. Lecture notes. The same routine. But I noticed something. I looked forward to my class in a way I hadn't before. And not just the class. The boundaries were still there. Clear. Untouched. But I felt the first tremor of something beneath them, like a crack forming in the ice, not enough to break through, but enough to know the surface wasn't as solid as I thought. That's where it began. Not with a kiss, not with a confession, not with some sweeping betrayal. It began with the smallest things, a glance held a second too long, a question that lingered in the air, a diary pulled from a dusty drawer. And as much as I wanted to believe I could keep it there, tucked away in the margins of my days, I think part of me already knew, I was writing the first lines of a story I wouldn't be able to stop. The next few weeks unfolded with a rhythm that felt both unsettling and oddly comforting, as though I had slipped into a new kind of routine layered over my old one. I would wake, prepare coffee in the same chipped mug I'd used for years, listen to the kettle hiss, and then spend an entire breakfast rehearsing how I would keep things strictly professional, how I would smile in class and nothing more. And then I would step into the lecture hall, see him sitting there, always in the second row, always with that attentive stillness, and all my rehearsals would crumble like dry paper in my hands. It wasn't just his presence, it was the way he leaned forward when I spoke, elbows on the desk, as though every word mattered. It was the way he stayed behind after the others left, lingering with his questions, his observations, his small flashes of humor that seemed to catch me off guard. I told myself it was harmless. A bright student, an engaged professor, this was how it was supposed to be. But beneath that, something else stirred, something I didn't want to name. One Tuesday, rain had turned the campus pathways into slick ribbons of gray, and most of my students rushed off the moment class ended. He stayed. He asked if I needed help stacking the books I'd brought for reference. His voice was casual, but there was a hesitation under it, like he wasn't sure if he should even offer. I nodded, too quickly, and handed him a stack. We worked quietly at first, moving books from desk to shelf, the rain tapping at the windows behind us. Then a conversation started, not about the syllabus or an upcoming paper, but about a poem he said he couldn't stop thinking about. He recited a line softly, half to himself, and it caught me off guard. I found myself answering not as his professor, but as someone who remembered being moved by those same words decades ago, when they still felt raw. The rain grew heavier. The room felt smaller. At one point, our hands brushed as we reached for the same book. It was nothing, just skin against skin for half a second, but my breath caught, and I knew he felt it too because he froze, the book suspended between us. I told myself to step back, to laugh it off, to keep this where it belonged. But instead, I found myself holding his gaze. It was only a few seconds, but it felt like standing at the edge of something I couldn't see the bottom of. He was the one who looked away first, setting the book down, clearing his throat. I should have said something to puncture the tension, something safe and mundane, but the words didn't come. When he finally gathered his bag to leave, he paused at the door, as if something held him there. The rain behind him was just a blur of gray. He turned, and there was a look in his eyes, not bold, not demanding, just quietly searching. I stepped toward him. I don't even remember deciding to. It was as if my feet moved before my mind caught up. We stood there, a breath apart, with only the sound of rain filling the silence. And then, it happened. We kissed. It was brief, almost tentative, like we were both testing the shape of something we didn't quite understand. There were no words, no declarations, just that moment suspended in air. When we pulled back, reality rushed in, sharp and cold. I felt it first, the guilt, the panic, the electric awareness of what had just happened. He blinked, as though waking from a dream, and stepped back. He didn't say anything, and neither did I. He left the room quietly, his footsteps soft in the hallway. I stayed there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes, staring at the shelves, at the rain outside, at my own reflection faintly visible in the glass. My lips still tingled, my thoughts tangled in knots I couldn't untie. On the walk home, the world felt distorted. The rain had stopped, leaving puddles that reflected the fading sky. I tried to frame it as nothing, a slip, a mistake, something that could be tucked away and forgotten. But that night, when I opened my diary, my hand shook as I wrote. I described the rain, the books, the way his hand had brushed mine, and then, finally, the kiss. I stared at the word for a long time, almost unable to believe I had written it. I didn't write about guilt, not exactly. I didn't write about what it meant, or what it might lead to. I only wrote the facts, as if by doing so I could strip them of meaning. But deep down, I knew that a single line had been crossed, and there was no going back to the clean, unbroken version of myself that had existed just hours before. When my husband came home, I sat with him at dinner. He asked about my day, and I answered with practiced ease. I spoke about a faculty meeting, about papers to grade, about the weather. I didn't mention the empty classroom, the rain on the windows, or how everything had changed in one quiet moment. He didn't notice anything different. Or if he did, he didn't say so. He read the news on his tablet, and I sat across from him, my diary in the next room, holding words that would never be meant for his eyes. That night, I lay in bed with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling. I thought about the kiss, not just the act itself, but the silence that followed, the way neither of us had spoken. It wasn't a grand betrayal. Not yet. But it was a breach. A first crack. And as I lay there, listening to my husband's steady breathing beside me, I knew it was only a matter of time before that crack widened. The morning after that kiss felt almost unreal, as if I'd woken into a version of my life that looked the same but didn't quite fit anymore. Everything was in its place, the chipped mug on the counter, the stack of dishes by the sink, the familiar shuffle of my husband's footsteps as he moved around the kitchen, but I felt like an intruder in my own world. I kept my head down while making coffee, focusing on the small motions, pouring water, measuring grounds, wiping a stray grain off the counter. It gave me something to do with my hands, something to keep me from meeting his eyes. He didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't say a word. He asked the usual questions, "What's your schedule like today?" And I gave the usual answers. My voice sounded steady, but my mind was a storm. Every time I blinked, I felt again the rain against the window of that classroom, saw his face too close, and felt the weight of that single, irreversible moment. I tried to convince myself that I could tuck it away, that the kiss could become just an odd memory, something I'd never have to revisit. I could draw the line now, set the boundary again, seal the crack before it spread. That's what I told myself as I walked to campus, clutching my bag a little too tightly, rehearsing how I would keep things normal. But the moment I entered the lecture hall, I felt the shift. He was there already, sitting in his usual seat in the second row, his notebook open, his eyes searching for mine. When they found me, something passed between us, something unspoken, sharp, undeniable. The lecture itself was ordinary on the surface. I spoke about themes in the text, guided the discussion, asked questions, gave answers. But underneath the academic rhythm, there was a current pulling at me. Every time his hand lifted, every time his gaze held mine a second too long, I felt it. When the class ended, most of the students gathered their things and left quickly, eager for lunch or the next lecture. He lingered, as I knew he would. He approached the desk, carrying a book he'd borrowed from the library. He placed it on the table between us, his fingers brushing the cover, and said something about a passage he'd been thinking about. His voice was quiet, almost careful. I listened, nodding, responding, trying to keep my answers measured, professional. But there was a warmth creeping in, a softness that didn't belong in a professor's voice. For a moment, we both seemed to forget what had happened the day before, or maybe we were pretending to forget. The kiss wasn't mentioned. Not a word about it passed between us, but it lived in the silence. When he left, I sat alone in the empty classroom for a while, staring at the desk where his hand had rested. I thought about what it would mean to shut this down, to send a clear message that whatever had happened couldn't happen again. But the truth was, I didn't want to. That evening, at home, I opened my diary again. I hadn't meant to write every night, but my hand seemed to move on its own, the pen scratching across the page as I poured out the things I couldn't say out loud. I wrote about the way he listened. About the way his eyes lingered, not in a crude way, but in a way that made me feel seen. I wrote about the kiss, again, and about how it had left a mark I couldn't ignore. But more than anything, I wrote about myself. About the version of me that had been sleeping for years, the part of me that had once been vibrant, spontaneous, capable of feeling something sharp and alive. That part had been missing for so long I'd almost forgotten it existed. I didn't notice my husband come into the room until he spoke. "Writing again?" he asked, his voice curious but flat. I closed the diary quickly, not slamming it, but quicker than necessary. I smiled, said it was nothing, just notes for class. He nodded, accepting the answer, or maybe just pretending to. He sat down across from me, scrolling through his tablet as he always did. I watched him, wondering if he sensed the shift, if he could feel the widening gap even if he didn't name it. The next day, and the day after, the rhythm continued. Lectures. Books. Quiet moments in empty classrooms. There was no second kiss, no dramatic scene. But there were glances. There were pauses in conversation that felt heavier than words. There were questions he asked that weren't really about literature, and answers I gave that weren't entirely professional. One afternoon, he asked, almost casually, why I always took off my wedding ring during lectures. I laughed, a quick, nervous sound. I don't like chalk dust under it, I said. It was true, technically. But the question lingered, and so did his look when I answered. That night, I wrote about the ring in my diary. I wrote about the way he'd noticed, about how that tiny observation had unsettled me. I didn't write about guilt, not directly. I didn't even write the word wrong. But every line I put down felt like evidence, something that would be impossible to explain if anyone ever read it. At dinner, my husband noticed I wasn't wearing my ring and asked if I'd misplaced it. "It's in my bag," I said quickly. "I took it off while teaching." He nodded again, just as casually as before. But his eyes lingered for a beat too long, and I wondered what he was thinking, what he saw. I thought of throwing the diary away that night. I even held it in my hands, standing over the trash can. But I couldn't do it. The words felt like the only place I was honest, the only place I could untangle the knot in my chest. Instead, I tucked it back into its drawer. I told myself, again, that I could stop this. That I could push it back over the line, erase the meaning from the kiss, return to being the woman I had been before. But each time I looked in the mirror, I knew that woman was already gone. The days following felt like they belonged to someone else's life. I went through each one with the same steady rhythm as before, waking early, grading papers, walking across campus under the same stretch of sky, but everything seemed slightly off, like a painting hung a fraction crooked. The kiss lived in the quiet between thoughts. Even when I wasn't thinking about it, I was. It was a Thursday when he surprised me with the book. The day had been long, a blur of meetings and lectures, my head stuffed with half-finished thoughts and the dry buzz of administrative chatter. When the class emptied out, he stayed behind, as usual. But this time, he didn't ask a question. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small, cloth-bound volume, worn at the corners in a way that spoke of long history. "I thought you might like this," he said, his tone careful, almost hesitant. The title caught me off guard. It was an out-of-print edition of poems we had mentioned in passing, one I hadn't seen in years. My breath hitched, just slightly. I ran my fingers over the cover, feeling the fabric beneath my thumb, and something about the weight of it, the thoughtfulness behind it, unsettled me more than the kiss ever had. It was one thing to share a glance, to let a moment slip. It was another to hold a piece of evidence in my hands, something that proved we were moving past the edge of the safe, explainable. I should have said something to make it lighter, to draw a line in words if I couldn't draw one in action. But what came out was softer. "This is thoughtful." He shrugged, his eyes flicking to mine and away again, like he wasn't sure how much to claim responsibility for the gesture. We talked about the poems for a while, longer than necessary, voices lower than they needed to be. And then, as though neither of us wanted the conversation to end, we walked outside together. The air was sharp, the kind of winter cold that nipped at your ears but didn't quite bite. Students hurried past with scarves pulled tight, their chatter rising and falling in waves. We walked slower, our pace measured, as if the world around us didn't exist. We spoke of the poems at first. Then the conversation wandered. He asked about my first year's teaching, what it had been like to step into a classroom for the first time. I asked about his plans after graduation, where he thought he might go, what he might do. It was easy, almost too easy. His curiosity was disarming, not the casual curiosity of a student fishing for details, but something more open, more earnest. At one point, he asked, "Do you like living here?" It was such a simple question, but it landed strangely heavy. I gave the practical answer first, about how quiet the town was, how the seasons were reliable, how I'd built a life here. But something in his expression nudged me to say more. "I don't know if like is the right word," I admitted. "Sometimes it feels like I just settled into it. And never moved again." The words hung there between us, half confession, half observation. He nodded but didn't push. And that, somehow, made it worse. We reached the corner where our paths diverged, and there was a pause, just long enough for me to wonder if he would say something more, if I would. But we didn't. He gave the smallest nod, a goodbye that felt like it held more than a word, and turned away. That night, I found myself staring at the book he had given me. I had placed it on the kitchen table while cooking, moved it to the side when we ate dinner, and now it sat under the lamp's glow like a quiet accusation. My husband noticed it. He picked it up, thumbed through the pages without much interest. "Where's this from?" he asked. "A student lent it to me," I said quickly. Too quickly. He nodded, the way he always did. He didn't ask which student. He didn't ask why. But his eyes lingered on the book for a second longer than they needed to before he set it down. After dinner, when the dishes were done and the lights were dimmed, I sat at the table alone and opened my diary. I wrote about the walk, about the cold air, about the question he had asked and how it had unsettled me. I wrote about the book, about the way his hand had brushed mine when he gave it to me. But more than that, I wrote about the silence. The moments between words. The way it felt like we were speaking in code neither of us had invented but somehow both understood. The diary was filling faster now. Pages and pages. It wasn't just a place to empty my thoughts, it was becoming something else, something dangerous, though I didn't name it that. Later, I found myself standing by the window, looking out at the street lamps casting pale pools of light. I thought about the line I kept promising myself I would draw. And then I realized I hadn't drawn it at all. Not when we kissed. Not when I took the book. Not when I opened my diary that night and wrote his name again. The line wasn't just blurred anymore. It was gone. The day started like any other, but there was a tension beneath the surface that I couldn't shake. The air felt heavier in the kitchen as I brewed my coffee, as if the walls themselves knew what I hadn't said out loud. My husband sat at the table, scrolling on his tablet the way he always did, the faint blue glow reflecting on his face. He didn't look up when I set his cup in front of him. I watched him for a moment longer than I meant to, searching for some sign that he could see the cracks forming inside me, but there was nothing. I carried that unease with me to campus. I tried to bury myself in the normal rituals, lecturing, answering questions, writing key points on the board, but my mind kept wandering. Every glance at him pulled me back into the uncertainty. He sat in his usual seat, taking notes with quiet focus, but there was something unspoken in the way his eyes met mine. The class ended, and like clockwork, the room emptied. Students shuffled out, chattering about weekend plans, exams, their own small worlds. He stayed. He always stayed. He waited until the door closed behind the last student before approaching my desk. This time, there was no book in his hand, no question about the syllabus. "You seemed distracted today," he said quietly. The words hung in the air, and I felt them hit. I should have brushed them off, laughed lightly, said I'd been thinking about an upcoming faculty meeting. Instead, I told the truth, or part of it. "I'm fine," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "Just a long week." He didn't press, but he didn't leave either. The silence stretched, filled only by the faint hum of the overhead lights. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was me, maybe it was him, maybe it was both of us at once. One step closer, another. The space between us disappeared. And then we kissed. This kiss was different. The first had been hesitant, almost accidental, a question neither of us had meant to ask. This one had intent behind it, even if neither of us said a word. When it ended, the silence was louder than before. We stepped back, both of us breathing harder than we should have been, both avoiding the other's eyes for a long moment. I tried to speak. "This, but the words faltered and I let them die in my throat. He just nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something we couldn't define, and then he gathered his things and left without another word. I stayed in the empty classroom for a long time after, staring at the door he had walked through, feeling the shape of that kiss linger in the air. By the time I walked home, the sky was dimming. I told myself I would find a way to reset, to untangle everything before it knotted too tightly. But that promise felt hollow even as I made it. When I stepped into the house, the first thing I saw was the book he had given me sitting on the counter. My husband was holding it, turning it in his hands. "Interesting choice," he said, his voice even. I froze. "What do you mean?" He looked at me for a beat too long before setting the book down. "I just didn't think you were into these old editions anymore." I forced a small smile, but my chest felt tight. "A student lent it to me," I said, repeating the same explanation I'd given the first time he asked. He nodded again, the way he always did, but this time the silence after felt heavier. That night, I opened my diary and stared at the blank page for what felt like hours before I began to write. I wrote about the classroom, the way his voice had sounded, the look in his eyes. I wrote about the kiss. I wrote about the moment after, the way he had left without a word, and the ache that came with that silence. I didn't write about guilt directly, though it seeped into every sentence. I didn't write about what would happen if anyone ever saw these pages. But the thought pressed at the back of my mind as I wrote. Later, I sat at the kitchen table while my husband read the news. He looked up once, caught me staring at nothing, and asked, "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said. It wasn't a lie, not exactly. I was fine on the outside, going through all the motions. But inside, I felt like someone had tipped my life slightly off balance, and it wouldn't stop tilting. That night, I placed the diary back in the drawer, closed the lamp, and lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling. I kept thinking about the second kiss, how it felt different, how it had crossed some invisible threshold the first one only touched. And I knew, as I lay there, that something had shifted again, and that this time there was no pretending otherwise. The days after that second kiss stretched long and thin, like thread pulled too tight. Every hour seemed louder somehow, every sound sharper, as if the air itself was aware of what I was trying to hide. I still taught my classes, still made coffee in the mornings, still shared dinners with my husband, but there was a tremor underneath it all, a hum of tension I couldn't silence. The diary became both a refuge and a weight. I wrote every night, the pen moving before I even thought about what I wanted to say. Some pages were full of facts, almost clinical in tone, as if writing them that way would make them harmless. Others bled with the things I couldn't admit aloud, words that felt dangerous just sitting there in ink. One evening, I left the diary on the table while I stepped into the other room. When I came back, I saw my husband standing by the counter, a stack of unopened mail in his hands. The diary sat just inches away from him, the leather cover slightly askew, and for one terrifying moment, I thought I saw his hand move toward it. He didn't touch it. Not then. But something in me shifted. The sight of it lying there in plain view, vulnerable, made my chest tighten. I tucked it away in a drawer that night, as if the wood could protect the words inside. The next day on campus, I felt a strange heaviness before I even saw him. The classroom was full, the usual rustle of notebooks and quiet chatter, but I sensed him before I spotted him, second row, leaning forward, notebook open, eyes already on me. I taught the lecture the same way I always did, but I could feel the weight of what hadn't been said between us. The words I spoke about the text felt detached, like they belonged to someone else. After class, he stayed again. He didn't bring up the kisses. He didn't ask what they meant. But his questions about the books had a different edge now, a softness that carried something unspoken. When he finally left, I sat alone in the empty room, my hand resting on the desk, feeling the ghost of his presence in the space he'd just occupied. That night, I wrote in the diary again. I wrote about the look in his eyes, about the quiet between us. I didn't write the word guilt, but it hovered there, just beneath the surface of every sentence. The following evening, something happened I hadn't expected. I came home to find my husband sitting at the kitchen table, the diary in his hands. It took me a moment to register what I was seeing. The cover was open, his thumb resting between pages. My breath caught. He didn't look up immediately, just stared down at the words. I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it would shake the walls. He finally looked at me, but his face gave nothing away. "I didn't mean to pry," he said, voice steady, almost too steady. "It was just open." I wanted to speak. I wanted to explain, to reach for some excuse, but my tongue felt heavy in my mouth. He closed the diary carefully and set it on the table, his hand lingering on the cover for just a second too long before he stood and walked away. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. When I finally picked up the diary, I saw which page he had been on. It wasn't the worst one, but it wasn't safe either. My words were there in black ink, stripped of all the context that had existed only in my head. That night, I couldn't write. I sat with the pen in my hand, staring at the page, but every word felt like a risk. The next morning, he acted as if nothing had happened. He made coffee, read the news, asked if I had office hours that day. But there was a stiffness in the air that hadn't been there before, a quiet awareness neither of us named. I carried that silence with me to campus. When I saw him in class, everything felt sharper again, the sound of his chair sliding back, the scratch of his pen across paper. I wondered if he could sense the shift in me, if he saw the way my gaze darted away faster now, or the way my voice caught on certain words. After class, when he stayed behind, I almost told him we couldn't keep meeting like this. I almost said the words that would draw the line I'd been promising myself I would draw. But I didn't. Instead, we talked about a passage from the assigned text, our voices low, our words winding into something that wasn't really about the book at all. That night, I wrote again. My hand shook, but I wrote. I wrote about my husband's eyes on the diary, about the way he had set it down without saying what he had really read, what he really thought. I wrote about the fear of what he knew, fear of what I was becoming, fear of how close the truth felt now, breathing against my neck. I wrote until my hand ached. And when I finally closed the diary, I knew it had become more than a collection of pages. It was a crack in my life, one I couldn't close, no matter how hard I pressed the cover shut. The morning I left for the conference, the house felt unnaturally still, as if even the walls were holding their breath. My suitcase sat by the door, the zipper straining over clothes packed too quickly the night before. I had told myself that this trip was purely professional, a necessary obligation for faculty, nothing more. But my husband's quiet eyes as I moved around the kitchen told me he wasn't convinced. He didn't say much while I made breakfast. He buttered his toast slowly, almost methodically, and kept glancing at the suitcase, then at me. "How long will you be gone?" he asked, his voice steady but too even, like he had practiced keeping it that way. "2 nights," I said, pouring coffee I didn't really want. He nodded, but his gaze didn't leave me. There was a pause, and for a moment I thought he might say more, ask something, accuse something, but he didn't. He just reached for his cup and drank. The drive to the train station felt longer than it was. The winter sky pressed low, a dull gray that blurred the horizon. My hands tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. I met him at the platform. He was already there, a book tucked under his arm, his face brightening when he saw me. That small expression, that simple smile, hit harder than I expected. We didn't talk much on the train. There were other passengers, the clatter of wheels against tracks, the occasional announcement overhead. But in the silence between us, there was something undeniable, a current that had been building for months and now felt almost solid in the air. The conference itself was what it was supposed to be: lectures, panels, crowded rooms full of half-familiar faces. We sat through sessions, nodded at presentations, made the expected small talk. But every time we glanced at each other, there was an unspoken understanding that none of this, the lectures, the panels, the polite exchanges, was why we were really here. By the time evening came, the city lights had started to glow against the early dark. We walked back to the hotel slowly, the sound of our footsteps blending with distant traffic. Neither of us said what we were thinking. Neither of us had to. In the room, there was a moment, a single, suspended moment, where everything could have still been undone. I could have set my bag down, sat at the desk, called my husband, told him about the lectures I had attended and the notes I had taken. But I didn't. We spent the night together. The sentence is simple, stripped of detail, but the weight of it filled the room, filled me. When morning came, the light through the window was pale and unkind. The city outside was already moving, cars passing, people walking, a world that had no idea what had shifted inside me. I lay still for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the heater. He was quiet beside me, and when he finally spoke, it was about nothing, a mention of the day's schedule, a reminder of the next panel. But the silence between those words carried the truth neither of us named. The second day passed in fragments, more panels, more polite conversation, more pretending everything was as it should be. But every moment felt sharper, tinged with the knowledge of what we had crossed. On the train ride back, I stared out the window as the gray fields blurred past. He sat beside me, reading the book he'd brought, and for long stretches, we didn't speak. But every time our shoulders brushed, I felt a jolt, a reminder. When I arrived home, the house was dark. My husband was in the kitchen, a mug of tea cooling beside him, a stack of unopened mail at his elbow. "Did the conference go well?" he asked, looking at me too directly. "It was fine," I said, my voice steady but thinner than I wanted. He nodded, but the pause after felt like a weight pressing down. I carried my bag upstairs, unpacking in silence. My hands trembled as I folded clothes, as if the fabric itself carried evidence. That night, lying in bed beside him, I stared into the darkness and thought about the line I had once believed I would never cross. It was gone. And there was no pretending otherwise. The house felt different when I came back from the conference, even though nothing had physically changed. The walls were the same muted beige, the same framed photos lined the hallway, the same faint scent of coffee and laundry lingered in the air. But it wasn't the same. The silence had a texture now, thicker, harder to step through. I unpacked my bag carefully that evening, folding clothes as though precision could erase what they carried with them. My hands shook as I placed each blouse back into the drawer, as if my husband could read guilt in the creases. Downstairs, he moved around the kitchen, the sound of cabinets opening and closing drifting up the staircase. When I joined him, he was sitting at the table, flipping through the mail without real focus, his teacup untouched. "Was the conference productive?" he asked, his voice casual but his eyes anything but. "It was fine," I said. The words came out evenly, but they didn't sound like mine. He nodded, and the pause afterwards stretched. He didn't ask for details, what papers I'd heard, who I'd met. He just sat there, his fingers drumming lightly on the envelope in his hand, his gaze too steady. That night, we ate in silence. I tasted nothing of the food. Every scrape of a fork against a plate felt louder than it should, like the sound was bouncing off the walls and back into my head. Later, when we were both in bed, I stared into the dark and wondered if he could hear my thoughts, if the weight of them was pressing through the mattress, seeping into him as he lay beside me. His breathing was steady, but I couldn't tell if it was sleep or restraint. The next morning, I woke early, long before the alarm, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I barely sipped. The diary lay on the table in front of me, the leather cover worn smooth under my fingers. I thought about opening it, about writing it all down, the conference, the night, the way everything had shifted again. But for the first time, my hand hovered over the cover and didn't move. I imagined him finding it again. Imagined his eyes moving over the words, the quiet way he would close it, the heavier silence that would follow. When I arrived at campus, I felt like I was stepping into another world entirely, one that existed alongside my home life but didn't quite touch it. He was already in class, notebook open, as if nothing had changed. When our eyes met, it was different. There was no question anymore about what we had done, no pretending that the line hadn't been crossed. But there were no words either. The lecture went on as it always did, pages turned, pens scratched across paper, voices raised for questions. But I couldn't focus. Every word I said felt like a thread unraveling. After class, he stayed, of course. He didn't bring up the conference, didn't mention the night, didn't even let the word hotel pass his lips. But the air between us said it all. We spoke about a book, our voices low, our words controlled, but neither of us was really talking about literature. The pauses were longer now, the glances sharper. When he left, the silence he left behind was suffocating. That night, at home, I tried to write in the diary again. I sat there with the pen, the page blank in front of me, but the words wouldn't come. Every sentence I thought of felt like evidence. I closed the book without writing and shoved it back into the drawer. My husband walked into the room just then, glancing at me as if he'd been standing outside the door for longer than he admitted. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. I shook my head. "Just grading papers." He looked at me for a moment, then nodded and walked away, but I could feel his gaze lingering long after he'd left the room. The next few days blurred together. There was a strange, brittle politeness at home, questions about groceries, reminders about bills, the kind of talk that filled space but didn't touch anything real. At the university, the tension thickened. The way he lingered after class, the way I didn't tell him not to, it all felt like standing on a slope I couldn't stop sliding down. Every night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of my husband's breathing beside me and wondering how much he knew, how much he had guessed, how much he was waiting for me to say. The diary stayed in its drawer, unopened. But the words I hadn't written were just as loud as the ones I had. And in that quiet, I realized something that made my chest tighten: silence doesn't protect you. It only delays the moment when everything finally breaks. The confrontation didn't begin with shouting, or accusations, or anything you might expect. It started over something so ordinary it almost felt absurd: dinner plates left on the counter, a half-folded towel on the back of a chair. I had been home for hours, pacing between the kitchen and the living room, trying to decide if I could just keep pretending that life was still holding together. My husband came in quietly, the way he always did, and for a while, nothing happened. He set down his bag, took off his shoes, and asked about dinner. I made some small comment about leftovers, my voice thinner than I meant. He nodded and sat down at the table, scrolling on his phone. We went through the motions of a meal, forks clinking, glasses refilling, but there was no real conversation. There hadn't been for days, maybe weeks. Then, out of nowhere, he set his fork down and looked straight at me. "You've changed." The words were simple, but they landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward. I blinked at him, heart thudding. "What do you mean?" "You're different," he said, his voice calm but too calm, that rehearsed kind of calm that feels like a cover. "You come home and your mind is somewhere else. You look at me like you're looking past me." I opened my mouth to deny it, to deflect, but the words wouldn't form. Instead, I stared down at my plate, my fingers tightening around the fork. "It's been a long semester," I muttered finally, as if those words could hold the weight of everything they weren't saying. He didn't respond right away. He just looked at me for a long, quiet moment, and the silence between us felt louder than any argument. When he finally spoke, it wasn't with anger, but with something heavier. I don't know what's going on, but I know something is. I couldn't hold his gaze. That night, after the dishes were washed and the house was quiet again, the tension didn't lift. We moved around each other carefully, like strangers sharing a narrow hallway, our words clipped and cautious. When we went to bed, I lay there staring at the ceiling, my thoughts churning. I thought about the diary, about the pages already full, about the ones still blank. I thought about the hotel room, the train ride, the classroom, the 2 kisses. And I thought about the way he'd said you've changed. Not accusing. Just observing. The next morning, the politeness returned, but it was fragile, like glass that might shatter if touched too hard. He made coffee, asked about my schedule, but his eyes were watchful. On campus, the shift carried with me. The lecture felt like moving through water, every word I spoke coming out slower than it should. He was there, of course, sitting in the second row, pen moving across his notebook, but even his presence felt altered now, heavier. When the class ended, he stayed again. We didn't talk about the conference. We didn't talk about the night. We didn't talk about my husband. We talked about the book we were studying, but the pauses between sentences said everything we weren't saying. He looked at me once, his expression almost questioning, but I shook my head before he could ask anything out loud. Back home, the diary waited. I sat at the table for a long time before opening it. My pen hovered over the page before I started to write, not about him, not about the conference, not about the night we spent together. I wrote about the dinner table. The way his fork had paused midair. The way his eyes had held mine when he said, "You've changed." I wrote about guilt, not by name, but in every line. And when I closed the diary, my hands trembled. I knew then that something had broken, even if neither of us had said it aloud. And it couldn't be put back the way it was. The night that ended it all didn't come with any sort of dramatic crescendo. It arrived in the quiet, the kind of quiet that sinks into the walls and leaves you with nowhere to hide. Dinner was uneventful. I moved around the kitchen as though every step had been choreographed, setting plates, reheating leftovers, filling glasses. My husband sat at the table, scrolling through his tablet like always, the blue light painting his face. But there was no comfort in the routine anymore. Each scrape of a chair, each clink of a fork, carried weight. When we finished, he didn't pick up his tablet again. He didn't retreat to the living room or get up to check the mail. Instead, he stayed at the table, his hands folded in front of him. I started to clear the plates, but his voice stopped me. "Sit down." It wasn't harsh, but there was no softness in it either. I obeyed, placing the plates back on the table, lowering myself into the chair across from him. He didn't speak immediately. He just looked at me, steady, unblinking, and I realized that this was it, the moment I had been circling for weeks, maybe months. "I need to understand," he said finally. "Why?" The word cut through the air, simple but devastating. I opened my mouth, closed it, opened it again. I could have lied. I could have insisted there was nothing to tell, that everything was in my head, that he'd misunderstood. But the truth sat too heavily on my tongue. "I don't know if there's one reason," I said, my voice thin. He waited. I found myself talking, not in a rush, not in a flood, but in slow, halting sentences. I spoke about the years that had folded into each other, about how the routines had dulled everything sharp in me, how I had convinced myself that was normal. I told him I felt invisible, not unloved, not mistreated, but unseen. I didn't say names. I didn't give details. But I didn't need to. He sat there, his face unreadable, his jaw tightening only slightly when I paused too long, when the silence said more than my words did. The diary sat in the drawer just a room away. I imagined him opening it again, reading every line this time. Maybe he already had. Maybe he knew more than I thought. When I stopped speaking, the silence filled the space between us. He didn't yell. He didn't slam his hands on the table. He didn't storm out. He just nodded once, slow and deliberate, as though acknowledging something he'd known for a while but hadn't wanted to hear aloud. "So, what now?" he asked quietly. I had no answer. The rest of the night passed in fragments, small movements, hushed words, the kind of stillness that feels louder than noise. When we went to bed, we lay on opposite edges of the mattress. The distance between us had never felt so vast. I stared at the ceiling, listening to his breathing, wondering if sleep would come for either of us. It didn't. By morning, nothing had been decided, but everything had changed. We moved around the kitchen like ghosts, making coffee, buttering toast, our words clipped and sparse. When he left for work, the house felt hollow. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the diary. I opened it one last time, running my fingers over the filled pages, reading pieces of myself I wasn't sure I recognized anymore. I didn't write that morning. I closed the diary, slid it into the drawer, and pushed it shut. Not to forget. Just because there was nothing left to say. Everything had been said, in one way or another. And the silence that followed was all that remained.